the Supreme Court has delivered a major 7-1 ruling that is already sending shockwaves across the United States, especially among gun owners, constitutional lawyers, lawmakers, and state officials. Legal analysts are already describing this as one of the most important firearm-related decisions in recent months, and millions of Americans are now trying to understand exactly what this ruling means for the future of gun rights, federal authority, and constitutional law moving forward. This isn't just another routine court decision buried in legal paperwork. This is the kind of ruling that could influence future gun law battles across the country for years to come. And because it came from the nation's highest court, every lower court in America will now be paying close attention to the legal standards and constitutional reasoning behind it. Now, before we fully break this down, if you enjoy these kinds of legal and political updates, make sure to subscribe to the channel. A large percentage of people who regularly watch these videos still aren't subscribed, and supporting the channel helps more viewers stay informed when major Supreme Court rulings like this happen. Alright, let's get into what happened. Earlier today, the Supreme Court of the United States issued a 7-1 decision involving firearm regulations, constitutional protections, and the authority of lower federal courts. While the technical legal details of the case are complex, the broader message coming from the court is already very clear. The majority signaled strong concern about how firearm-related restrictions are being handled and whether certain government actions are going beyond constitutional boundaries protected under the Second Amendment. Almost immediately after the ruling was released, reactions exploded nationwide. Gun rights groups celebrated the decision as a major constitutional victory. Several Second Amendment organizations released statements arguing that the Supreme Court is continuing to strengthen protections for lawful gun owners across America. Meanwhile, supporters of stricter gun regulations expressed concern that the decision could weaken future efforts to enforce firearm restrictions at both the federal and state level. And that's why this ruling matters so much. This case arrives during a time when the entire country is deeply divided over gun policy. Across the United States, states are fighting major legal battles involving concealed carry permits, assault weapon restrictions, magazine capacity limits, waiting periods, licensing requirements, and red flag laws. Because of that, any major Supreme Court ruling touching firearm issues instantly becomes nationally significant. Now, according to legal experts reviewing the decision, the Supreme Court's majority focused heavily on constitutional standards and the limits of government authority when regulating firearms. The justices emphasized that courts must carefully examine whether restrictions are consistent with constitutional protections rather than automatically deferring to government agencies or lower court interpretations. That point alone could have major consequences moving forward. For years, many firearm cases have depended heavily on how lower courts interpreted public safety concerns versus constitutional rights. But this latest ruling appears to signal that the Supreme Court wants stricter constitutional scrutiny applied when evaluating firearm restrictions. And because the decision was so decisive, 7-1, it's sending a powerful signal to lower courts nationwide. Legal analysts believe this ruling may now influence multiple ongoing lawsuits involving firearm regulations in several states. Attorneys challenging gun restrictions are already expected to cite this case in future legal filings, arguing that the Supreme Court has strengthened constitutional protections connected to the Second Amendment. At the same time, states defending stricter gun laws may now face tougher legal challenges in federal court. Now, it's important to understand exactly what this ruling does, and what it does not do. This decision does not instantly erase all firearm laws across the country. States still retain authority to regulate firearms in many areas. Existing laws do not simply disappear overnight because of this ruling. However, what the decision does is potentially reshape the legal framework courts use when reviewing future gun-related cases. And that distinction is extremely important, because in constitutional law, the legal standard used by courts often determines whether future restrictions survive or fail. If the Supreme Court raises the constitutional bar for firearm regulations, that could make it significantly harder for governments to defend broad restrictions moving forward. And many experts believe that is exactly what may be happening here. Now let's talk about the political response, because that has also been intense. Within hours of the ruling, political leaders from both parties began reacting publicly. Several Republican officials praised the Supreme Court for defending constitutional freedoms and limiting what they described as government overreach. Some Democratic leaders, however, criticized the decision and warned that it could complicate efforts to pass or enforce certain firearm regulations in the future. Gun rights activists across social media also reacted immediately, with many calling the ruling a massive win for the Second Amendment and a continuation of the court's recent direction on firearm rights. And this is where the broader context becomes important. Over the last several years, the Supreme Court has steadily expanded constitutional protections tied to firearm ownership. Several landmark decisions have reinforced the idea that the Second Amendment protects an individual right to keep and bear arms. This latest ruling appears to continue that trend. Legal scholars are already comparing today's decision to earlier Supreme Court rulings that reshaped Second Amendment law nationwide. While this case may not carry the exact same historical weight as those earlier landmark cases, many experts believe it strengthens the broader constitutional framework established by them. That means future courts may now feel pressure to follow a more aggressive constitutional interpretation when reviewing firearm restrictions. And that could create major ripple effects nationwide. For example, lawsuits challenging assault weapon bans, magazine restrictions, permit requirements, and concealed carry limitations may now gain stronger legal footing depending on how lower courts interpret this ruling. Some attorneys are even predicting a new wave of Second Amendment lawsuits over the next several months as gun rights groups attempt to use this decision to challenge additional restrictions. At the same time, states supporting stronger gun regulations may begin rewriting legal strategies to better defend their laws under the constitutional standards emphasized by the Supreme Court. So this ruling may not just affect one case, it could influence the entire legal battlefield surrounding gun rights in America. Now, another major part of this story involves the Supreme Court itself and the direction the justices appear to be moving. The court's conservative majority has repeatedly signaled skepticism toward broad government restrictions involving constitutional freedoms. Whether the issue involves speech, religious liberty, administrative authority, or firearm rights, the court has increasingly emphasized constitutional limits on government power. And tonight's ruling fits directly into that pattern. Several legal commentators have described the decision as another example of the court reasserting constitutional protections against what some justices view as overly broad regulatory power. At the same time, critics argue that these rulings could limit the ability of lawmakers to address serious public safety concerns through modern firearm regulations. So once again, America finds itself deeply divided, not only politically, but constitutionally. And because gun rights remain one of the most emotionally charged issues in the country, this ruling is likely to remain at the center of national debate for quite some time. Now, let's talk about what may happen next. Because this was a Supreme Court ruling, lower federal courts throughout the country will now have to consider its reasoning in future firearm cases. Judges reviewing gun law challenges may begin citing this decision when evaluating whether restrictions meet constitutional standards. That means the effects of today's ruling could slowly expand over time as additional lawsuits move through the legal system. Several ongoing cases involving firearm restrictions could also be directly affected depending on how attorneys use this ruling in future arguments. And many experts believe we could eventually see even larger Second Amendment battles return to the Supreme Court in the near future. That possibility alone is why so many people are paying attention tonight. For millions of Americans, this issue goes far beyond politics. Supporters of gun rights view these cases as battles over constitutional freedom and individual liberty. Supporters of stricter regulations, meanwhile, argue that firearm laws are necessary to address public safety and reduce violence. The Supreme Court now sits directly at the center of that national conflict. And every major ruling has the potential to shift the legal and political landscape even further. So while tonight's 7-1 decision may not instantly transform every gun law in America overnight, it clearly represents another major step in the ongoing constitutional battle over firearm rights and government authority. The biggest question now is how far this legal shift will go. Will lower courts begin striking down more firearm restrictions? Will states change how they write future gun laws? Will Congress attempt new legislation in response? And could the Supreme Court eventually take up even bigger Second Amendment cases in the coming years? Right now, nobody knows for certain. But one thing is absolutely clear, this ruling has already created major shockwaves across America's legal system, political system, and national debate over gun rights. And the impact may only be beginning. If you found this breakdown helpful and want more updates on major Supreme Court decisions and national legal developments, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. It really helps support the channel and ensures you stay informed when the next major ruling happens.